Welcome to the Prison Professors Podcast. We serve people who face challenges with prosecution, sentencing, and prison. My co-founders are Sean Hopwood and Justin Paperny. My name is Michael Santos. We create digital content and our team offers individual consulting services. We also assist agencies that want to improve outcomes. To learn how we can help you, text the word PrisonPro to 44222. Again, text PrisonPro to 44222 and get our free brochure. You can also visit us at prisonprofessors.com or contact Justin at 818-424-2220. Please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. Send confirmation that you reviewed our podcast and we'll send you a free digital book. Stay tuned for a 20 to 30-minute episode of Prison Professors. Welcome to the Prison Professors program. My name is Michael. Today, I am really thrilled to introduce you to somebody who has inspired me a lot. His name is Marc Levin, and although he's never been incarcerated before, he has a lot of insight in improving outcomes and speaking about what types of reforms can we make so that more people leave our prison system as law-abiding, contributing citizens. And I really believe that the more information we can provide to people in prison, the more training we give them and the more inspiration we give them, the more hope we give them that they can become better. So today we get to listen to a leader. And first of all, I just want to thank you, Marc, for taking time out of your busy schedule to speak with us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and the organization that you represent right now, just to get us started?
Sure. Well, I'm an attorney by trade, and I got into this work in 2005, and I started the criminal justice program at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, which is the free market think tank in Texas. And, you know, one of our board members felt from a biblical perspective, we really ought to start looking at this criminal justice thing, because the organization had been focused on education and taxes and so forth. And so this was another area where, frankly, we were seeing that what the government was doing was too often not producing the intended results. And we really needed to look carefully at how many people Texas was putting into prison, and the fact that it really wasn't the best way and the most cost-effective way to improve public safety. So I came on board in March of 2005 at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and then for the first several years, we focused just on Texas. And as many people may know, in 2007, Texas adopted a major justice reinvestment package. We, instead of building what were projected to be 17,000 more prison beds, we invested money in alternatives such as treatment, reentry programs in prison, so more people would be suitable for parole. And we drug courts, all the whole, $241 million instead of several billion dollars in more prisons. And so that attracted a lot of national attention. And then that led in 2010, I came up with the phrase "right on crime" for our national campaign. And we launched that. And now we've got directors in 6 states. We got 2 people working in the DC area. So it's really expanded to be actually our largest policy area is criminal justice reform.
One of the real interesting things about your organization is that you represent a lot of the conservatives of government. And sometimes people in prison have a misperception that conservatives want to be hard on crime. But the reality is, I believe that any person of leadership wants to be smart on crime. And that's what Right on Crime, your organization, really stands for, about improving outcomes and best-in-class reforms, whether it's the prison term, the sentencing system. I would like you to tell our audience a little bit about why conservatives are behind this movement, what type of return on investment they're getting, and why it makes sense to invest in programs that will make communities safer and make human beings more readily accessible and available to function as law-abiding citizens upon their release.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Conservatives are traditionally skeptical of big government programs, and there's no bigger government program than prison. And then even within that, nothing takes someone's liberty away more than solitary confinement. It's like a prison within a prison. So we've started addressing that as well. But the reality is there's so many reasons conservatives embrace criminal justice reform. And I always tell people that, it's not just about saving money. That's the appetizer. The main course is public safety, keeping families together, getting people in the workforce, human dignity. But the saving money part does bring policymakers to the table, because at least in the states, unlike the federal government, the legislators actually have to balance the budget every session, and prisons are one of the top 5 costs in state government budgets, and also county jails are number 1 or 2 in virtually every county. So that's an important part of it as well. So we've addressed, sentencing reform, drug sentencing reform. We're working on bail reform now, which has a major impact on county jails because you've got so many people who can't afford to pay, but they're not a risk to anyone, and so they just languish in jail prior to their trial before being convicted of anything. And that's also one of the issues we've gotten into over the last several years is innocence issues, because too many people are wrongfully convicted. And we passed some really landmark legislation in Texas on forensics, where, we can go back with the DNA testing and make sure we got it right. And then also most recently, some legislation in the last session in Texas in 2017 dealing with jailhouse informants to make sure that we're not using incorrect information and that that's all disclosed to the judge, the jury, the defense, and so forth. So we need a criminal justice system that's fair, that gets results. I mean, what frustrates the American people, I think, is so many times people are discharged from prison and jails as well in worse shape than when they came in. And, in the medical system, we say the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. But too often our correctional institutions do more harm than good.
And part of the reason for that, I think, from somebody who served multiple decades in prison, is that prisons are designed to teach people how to live in prison. But the more skills somebody learns to live in prison, the less skills somebody learns to function in society. And we may call it a system of corrections, but the longer we keep somebody in corrections, the less likely that person is to function outside in the way that we want. And so I'm really excited about when I hear you saying that Texas invested money in rehabilitation programs and in programs that will result in lowering recidivism rates. Why don't you tell our audience a little bit about what type of return did you get with regard to your recidivism rates in Texas when you made this shift from building more prisons and 17,000 more beds to creating more programs? How did that work out?
It's been unbelievable. So, and if you go back to 2005, which is when I said I started the criminal justice program, but I'm not taking all the credit, that's for sure. We've had amazing other advocates in this field, including formerly incarcerated people we work with, and also, legislative champions. And Governor Rick Perry, now our current governor, remain very committed to this. But we, if you look at it, since we started this in 2005, the crime rate's down more than 30%, and the incarceration rate is down more than 20%. And that's happened in a number of other states that have actually cited Texas, like Georgia and South Carolina. And, they've said, look, we can do the same thing. And even, Georgia has almost kind of gone beyond even some of the reforms Texas has done. And they've had similar results. And in fact, when you look at it, crime's been declining nationally now for about 20 years, but it's actually gone down more in the states that have reduced incarceration during this time frame. I think the bottom line is the research is so strong, especially when you look at people going to short prison terms for a year in many places for, it's typically a drug offense or other nonviolent offense. And there's, if they had gone into a drug court or a good probation program to get treatment and kept a job and kept their family, kept a place to live. I mean, when people get out of prison, they frequently have no place to live. And, if you're living under a bridge, that's not very good for public safety. So, but the point is, for people that are murdered someone or raped someone, yes, prison does prevent them from harming people in society for an extended period of time. And there's obviously an aging effect. People age out of crime. But the reality is for a lot of the people we send to prison, we're keeping them there relatively short periods, in some cases not even enough to go through a treatment program if there was one. And the data all shows comparable people that, for example, went into a drug court or mental health court, something like that, that we would actually get less recidivism and at a lower cost to the public.
When you talk about the types of sentence reforms, have you looked at any, or what have you guys found with regard to incentivizing a pursuit of excellence? So if a person in prison is behaving in the way that we would like him to behave, meaning he's pursuing classes, he's avoiding criminal associates, he is focusing on building strong mentor relationships, have you seen any receptivity from legislators across the country with regard to trying to incentivize, people who are adjusting in ways that might suggest they're ready to function in society as a law-abiding citizen?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, a lot of states have adopted earned time provisions, including Texas, for our state jail system, as well as for people on probation. And I would say of all the federal reforms that's pending on the federal prison system, the one that everyone seems to agree on is earned time for completing programs while behind bars, rehabilitative programs, educational, vocational. It does get back to what you were talking about earlier, which some people refer to as the parallel universe model for what we ought to be doing with prisons to make them look as much as possible like ordinary society, and that includes incentives, so that in the real world your behavior affects the conditions of your life, and also you have to make choices every day. I toured prisons in Germany a few years ago as part of a delegation from the United States. It included several corrections directors, but I was struck by the fact that it was up to the people there in prison. They were responsible for going to work every morning. They got paid for making bumpers, but they decided what books they wanted to check out at the library. They just picked out ingredients and prepared meals. And then I contrast that to the United States. One of my favorite programs is the prison entrepreneurship program in Texas, where they have a business plan competition, bring in business leaders. They have a reentry component. I mean, they have people that are millionaires now that, were in prison. But one of the things they told me is they take people coming out of prison out for their first dinner. And some of them would just stare at the menu, and the minutes just keep ticking by because they haven't had to make a choice for so many years. They just look at the menu and they can't decide what to order. So that's exactly why we need to have conditions and programs in prison that reinforce people's sense of autonomy and their ability to make decisions and be accountable for those decisions, so that because that's what they're going to be facing when they get out.
My partner, Sean Hopwood, and I had an opportunity to tour 3 prisons in the Houston and Dallas area, a couple of months ago with a private prison company, MTC. And while we were there, we saw a phenomenal investment in programs, including the one that you just described, the prison entrepreneurship program, where the men were so excited to be learning new skills and developing business models and actually making a pitch deck on what their investment would be. And without a doubt, they learned those types of skills that are going to translate into selling themselves to employers or to creditors or to perhaps even somebody might rent them an apartment. The reality is those are the types of programs that can really move the needle for somebody in prison. They can inspire and educate. But my question for you is, how have the prison system, the prison, I guess we would call them stakeholders, or the people who work in prisons, how receptive have they been to these ideas about bringing programs such as Prison Entrepreneurship Program across the country?
Well, in Texas, we've had very good success with the corrections agency, and most wardens, I think, want this. I'm not sure the system really incentivizes them. And it's not just these types of programs, but it's even visitation, which we know if a prisoner stays in touch with their family members, wife, children, etc., that is going to reduce recidivism. There's academic studies that show that. So, but the problem is, I mean, for most prison wardens, their number one thing in terms of how they're incentivized, and of course it applies to corrections directors too, is first of all, no escape, security. And we get that. I mean, that is critical, but they're not judged by their recidivism rates. So if they were, I think it would just provide a real systemic incentive to promote visitation, to promote volunteers coming in, whether they're with Prison Fellowship or other groups to work with inmates. And sometimes that access is spotty. It varies from one prison to another. It depends on that warden's attitude. And then also what you're talking about, getting nonprofits like Prison Entrepreneurship into the prison. And, again, they've gotten into a lot of prisons in Texas. So, but I think that's more because the warden may have a personal passion for it, but they really don't have any incentive because, again, they're not evaluated based on recidivism. They're at most evaluated based on security incidents. So I think we need to transform the system where there's a real institutional incentive for wardens and heads of departments of corrections to, not only reduce recidivism, but, have more people in prison getting vocational certificates, degrees, and so forth. And we need to be, rewarding success.
You certainly led the way in Texas in bringing this important issue to the attention of leaders in your state, and I know that many other states are following suit. We're out here in California, where we have worked with the secretary and much of the leadership of the California Department of Corrections, where they now have a milestone program, and that means that individuals who go through specific programs can actually earn credit for every one they complete that will reduce their period of time in prison. Across the United States, have you seen more receptivity to that type of a reward for excellence or pay for performance type of a model in other states besides Texas and California? And if so, could you talk with us about what you see that's promising?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, for example, we've worked closely with the American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a group of conservative legislators, and I've drafted and passed more than a dozen model policies, and one of them deals with earned time incentives for completing programs. And I also think there's a real role for incentive funding in the correction system. So some states, particularly in the juvenile side, like Ohio, Illinois, they basically said, they realized that there was this incentive for counties to just dump people onto the state prison system or the state juvenile lockups. And so they said, look, if you send fewer people to state lockups, then you can keep a share of the savings. And then they also built in some incentives, financial incentives for reducing recidivism and positive outcomes. So that's has a real potential. I mean, sometimes it's difficult to get the political will to change sentencing laws. So if you can, another way in addition to continuing to push that is to change the financial incentives, which are really misaligned in the system, so that local governments don't have a fiscal incentive just to dump people onto the state who really don't need to be incarcerated.
You've been in this space for 12 to 13 years. That means that since 2005, you've seen a lot of different shifts in political trends. Can you walk with us and tell us how much receptivity are you getting today versus when you first started these innovative practices of incentivizing excellence? How are leaders responding today versus 10 years ago?
Well, I mean, it's a sea change, really. Back, of course, the 90s were known for tough on crime and lock them up and throw away the keys, and that continued into the early 2000s. And, I do think the economic crisis back in 2008, that prompted a number of states to have to look at their budgets more closely. And then I think one of the other main trends has been more research. I mean, it used to be assumed that nothing worked except prison. And now there's lots of studies, whether it's on cognitive behavioral therapy or drug courts or other medication-assisted treatment for opioid addiction, for example. So there's lots of research, and along with that is the development of technologies. I mean, there's all sorts of electronic monitoring technologies now that didn't exist then. There's actuarial risk and needs assessment instruments that can better match the right person with the right program and level of supervision. So those developments have made a major difference as well. I mean, I don't think any state wants to kind of have it seem that they're stuck in the Stone Age, that they're not implementing best practices based on the most current research and technologies. So, I'm not one who's going to say prisons are ever going to be an anachronism. There's always going to be a need to incarcerate some segment of the population. But everyone knows the U.S. has 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. So certainly, as we do find out ways to improve public safety that are less costly, not only in financial terms, but in human terms, we ought to, be aggressive in implementing those. And I think the other major thing is that if you look at the political dynamics, I mean, when we started, we were the only group on the right that was advancing this. But now, I mean, one of my things I take the most pride in is there's so many other conservative groups now, whether it's Americans for Tax Reform, R Street, American Enterprise Institute, to go on a list that they're taking up these issues. So that's been a big change as well. And I think a lot of that is when we started Right on Crime, we put together a list of conservative leaders that would sign a statement of principles. And so we've got Newt Gingrich and Jeb Bush, J.C. Watts, Mike Huckabee, the former governor of Arkansas. So these are household names that conservative elected officials know and admire and respect. And so they know these people aren't soft on crime, but they really are. They've looked at the evidence, and they also, I think many of them are motivated by their faith, that we all know that redemption is possible, that someone is not necessarily the same person they were 15, 20 years ago. So all of those things have come together and I think produced a very receptive environment for continuing to improve our criminal justice system.
You mentioned earlier that formerly incarcerated people had a role in helping your efforts. Maybe you could give us some advice for somebody who is in prison today, listening to the Prison Professors podcast. Give that person some advice who he may want to come out and have a role like some of those formerly incarcerated people that contribute to your cause and help people understand what steps we can do to improve outcomes of the criminal justice system. What might be a pathway for him to begin building a resume that he could contribute to an organization like Right on Crime?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you, I recently saw a poll that was conducted just a couple months ago, and a national poll, and it showed that the top two messengers, to the public, who the public most trusted to tell them about criminal justice policy, were number one, police officers, but right below them were formerly incarcerated people. And then, members of Congress, judges, all these people were further down on the list. And, I've been testifying at many hearings, and a lot of the legislators, particularly those that chair the criminal justice committees in Texas, they've heard me a million times. But when someone, and so to wrap it up, Mark, we've heard this before, but when someone comes up who's formerly incarcerated, who's had firsthand experience, they really look up from their papers and pay attention. So I think that it's so compelling when you have someone who's seen the inside, that who's now doing well, overcoming tremendous obstacles, and is able to talk about what could have been done differently, perhaps, where they and perhaps some of the other people they interacted with while they were in prison could have had a better chance at success. Even though, again, they might have succeeded despite all those odds, we want to design a system where we really make the path to being law-abiding, to being productive, to taking care of your family, make that as easy as possible for people and remove those barriers. So I think certainly people that are formerly incarcerated should reach out to their elected officials. Obviously, first they have to take care of themselves and get on their feet. But, once they're able to do that, to be able to go in front of a committee, and in most states, anyone can sign up and testify. Certainly calling up their elected official, going to town halls, contacting them online, all of those things, because hearing from someone in their district really makes a huge difference. And I think we're also, see a lot of benefit in getting churches, business leaders involved. We've seen an increasing amount of that because everyone has a stake in this issue.
It's certainly an issue that influences every American citizen, because the billions of dollars that are going to criminal justice, if they are not being used effectively, those are billions of dollars that are not going into the building of hospitals and schools and roads and bridges. So it certainly does affect every American citizen. When you talk about the formerly incarcerated people who have been, I would say, maybe most influential or most helpful to this movement, what does their resume look like? I mean, we've got somebody like Sean Hopwood, who's really an amazing guy, but tell us about somebody else who you think has helped move the needle with regard to persuading conservatives, this makes sense, we need to create a pathway for more people to come out successfully. Can you describe somebody who you found to have been particularly effective?
Well, I'd have to say someone who's really been a mentor for me is Pat Nolan, who was formerly incarcerated. He was a assembly leader in California, elected official, and there were some allegations of some type of campaign finance filing issues or whatever, and he ended up locked up in federal prison. And he connected with Chuck Colson when he came out, and Chuck Colson was was involved in Watergate under President Richard Nixon, and he founded Prison Fellowship, and Pat went to work as soon as he got out, helping other people re-enter society. And Pat, interestingly enough, kind of in the early and mid 2000s, Pat had kind of informally started conversations with other conservatives in Washington, people like David Keene, who was previously chairman of the American Conservative Union. He's now editor at the Washington Times, but just kind of discussions over breakfast or whatnot, or coffee. And when I told Pat about Right on Crime idea, Pat was just elated and said, this is kind of formalizes what we've had, these informal discussions. And some of the people that are involved in those discussions, David Keene, for example, signed up with Right on Crime. So Pat was instrumental in helping us launch this. And, to this day, Pat continues to work on issues like, for example, some of the ones he's really passionate about are the shackling of pregnant women in prison, which is just a terrible practice. And also the issue of mental illness, which we haven't talked about, but that is so often goes untreated in the criminal justice system and leads to people cycling in and out of jail. So these are things that Pat has obviously seen firsthand, and that he's become a tremendous advocate for.
A couple of weeks ago, we saw the president hold a conference on prison reform, and we saw several leaders there. Can you give us an update on what we as American citizens should expect with regard to these reforms and a timeline that we might see things happening?
Yes, well, it's moving very fast. I've met with Jared Kushner several times, and our President Brooke Rollins met with President Trump about a week ago. And it's so encouraging that there's this consensus around reentry in particular. And so we're starting with a focus on reentry, even as we push forward on kind of holistic legislation in Congress. So we'll also include, I think, some sentencing reform, not as much as we would like, I'm sure. But this reentry component, we're going to be setting up programs in several states that are going to have state-of-the-art reentry services for people coming out of prison, and really to demonstrate that we can substantially reduce the recidivism rate, particularly by having what I would describe as a warm handoff, to have reentry services like mentoring that start while someone's still incarcerated and then continue seamlessly through their release. And that's through the use of an individualized reentry and success plan. So, I mean, our vision is that every person in America coming out of prison will have had a individualized reentry plan that was developed within 60 days of them being incarcerated. And that's the president shares that vision. I think we're going to make a huge impact on this. And frankly, as people see that there's ways to dramatically reduce recidivism, I think they're going to be increasingly open to the notion that, not only should we be sending fewer people to prison, but some of the people who are in prison don't need to serve nearly as long as they do. The research is very clear that just serving, 10 years instead of 7 years doesn't do anything to reduce recidivism. We could be taking some of that money and putting it into programming and this type of reentry support and really make a dent in our recidivism rates.
We've been listening and learning from Marc Levin, who is the policy director at Right on Crime. And I just want to take this time to thank you, Marc, for the work that you do. It's very important to everybody in our audience, and certainly important to me as somebody who went through prison for 26 years. I always knew we'd have a moment of reform. I knew it probably wouldn't start until I finished my entire sentence. But I just want to say we're very grateful to you for sharing your story with us. I'm going to leave you with the last word. If you have any final words of hope or inspiration that you might leave for our audience as we come to the end of this Prison Professors podcast.
Well, I would say, we need to move to a system that basically kind of grows when it fails to one that rewards results. I think that I would encourage people out there, those that have access to the internet, to go to our website, rightoncrime.com, and you can read more about what we're doing. And, I really think we're on the right path. I know progress hasn't come as quickly as, would be ideal. But if you look at the trend lines as far as incarceration and crime continuing to go down in this country, and really scaling up a lot of the alternatives, and more demand for people. There's so many companies every day that change their policies to hire people who are formerly incarcerated. So there is a lot of light at the end of the tunnel, and I think it's getting brighter.
Thank you very much. I am Michael with Prison Professors. If you'd like to learn more about Right on Crime, we will definitely have a link from our website in the show notes to their website. We encourage you to support their work because their work is the type of work that will lead to a smarter criminal justice system. If you'd like to learn anything more, please text the word Prison Pro to 44222 and you will send information on the work that we're doing. And you will again have link back to Right on Crime where you can read more about Marc Levin and his big team and what they're doing to reform criminal justice system in America. We'll be back tomorrow with another inspiring guest. Thank you.